Really insidious thing about violent extremist ideology. You are attracted to this because you're hurting. You're attracted to this ideology, and the ideology tells you you're a warrior for your people, whoever your people are.
The problem with suicidal thoughts is how intense they are. It feels like they will never end. And when you're in that, you have this kind of tunnel vision. It feels like it's going to last forever.
Majority of people look at a homeless person. They're a drug addict. They made bad choices. If homelessness was a punishment for bad choices, we'd all be homeless.
The women that are struggling, that gives the blowjob at $5, this for me is pure 100% exploitation.
I stabbed my wife 3 times one night because she wouldn't let me finish my bottle of vodka. Still not thinking I had a drink problem.
Ultimately, 1 in 2 Americans will experience family estrangement. So that's 50% of the population.
To be completely honest with you, I am a refugee, but I'm not just a refugee.
Because I am George, I'm not George with Down syndrome or Down's George, because that's not me.
Welcome to Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. This season will inspire you to empathize with people who are regularly marginalized and misunderstood. You won't want to miss a single episode, so hit the subscribe button now. Thanks for watching and enjoy the show.
So imagine sitting in a doctor's office and getting a diagnosis of cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and the doctor says, good luck. Unfortunately, that was in 2006. Unfortunately, this is still occurring, okay? It's still happening. And so as a result of not being properly educated, not knowing how to navigate the disease, I was at the time a sandwich generation caregiver. I was like 38 years old. I had 3 young kids. I had a career in something else. My life turned into just a cyclone of care. I went into this not knowing anything. And inevitably, which I see a lot, I ended up suffering a very, very, very severe nervous burnout.
Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today I'm joined by Claire Webster, a Certified Dementia Care Consultant, Certified Professional Consultant on Aging, and a sought-after conference speaker and educator in the field of dementia care. Claire is the founder and president of Caregiver Crosswalk, Inc., a consulting firm dedicated to providing education and support services for those caring for individuals with Alzheimer's disease and other dementia-related illnesses. She's also the founder and ambassador of the McGill University Dementia Education Program, where she works tirelessly to help raise awareness and equip caregivers with the tools that they need to navigate this complex journey. Claire's expertise is not only professional, but deeply personal. As a former care partner to her late mother, who lived with Alzheimer's disease, she has firsthand experience of the profound impact dementia has, not just on the person diagnosed, but on the entire family. This season, I am shining a spotlight on people who often feel marginalized or misunderstood. And through each conversation, my goal is to better understand different lived experiences in order to widen our circle of empathy. Given the work that Claire's been doing for more than a decade, I've invited her to discuss Alzheimer's and dementia care and share her insights about supporting those affected by it. So welcome to the show, Claire.
Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, so much to talk about. My grandfather also had Alzheimer's, so it's touched my life as well. I wonder if maybe you could share a little bit of your backstory that brought you to this. I don't know if you expected in your 20s to be doing this for a professional career. So,
oh my God, no. I had a background in sales and marketing and philanthropy. But I guess our past experience does lend some support when we're doing this type of work as well. So I was an only child. I had 3 young children, 2, 4, and 9 years old, and my father had passed away from congestive heart failure in 2005. And a year later, in 2006, my mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Prior to her diagnosis, I knew absolutely nothing about the disease, like nothing. I didn't even know the early signs and symptoms of dementia. I knew nothing. And I grew up in a home where my mother was a caregiver to my father, and there was a tremendous amount of stress around that. She was the sole caregiver. And so I would say that earlier on, prior to her diagnosis, even prior to my father's death, he would start telling me that there was something wrong with her, that, she was confused or her behavior was odd. But I kept discounting it on stress. I kept saying, well, Dad, basically it's your fault because she was physically caring for him. And but it was clear that not long after he passed away, that there were all these signs that were coming up where she wasn't able to manage the finances, her behavior was changing, all kinds of weird symptoms that were actually not related to memory. Because a lot of people think dementia is all about memory loss, and it doesn't necessarily begin that way. It can begin with just strange behavior. So my first challenge was I did not know what type of doctor to take her to see. So we went to see a family doctor who's recommended that we see a neurologist. And I was not prepared for the medical appointment, which happens a lot, right? Like I'm expecting here, I'm going to take my mother to see this neurologist against her will, by the way, because she didn't believe anything was wrong. And we're sitting at the neurologist office, and he's asking me these questions. Why are we here? And I'm answering, and she's sitting beside me, furious, and telling me that I'm lying and making all this stuff up. And then he performs the Montreal Cognitive Test, what we call the MOCA. Asked me if she was driving, which she was, and she had actually just had 2 car accidents recently. Declares that she failed the test. She was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Without warning, he picks up the phone, calls the driver's bureau, and cancels her license on the spot. And we are both sitting there completely dumbfounded. And I say to him, like, oh my God, like, now what? Like, now what? Right? And she was, next level furious. And he looked at us and he said, oh, well, there's some information on the web. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? He says, well, good luck, Mrs. Webster. And that was it. There was nothing else. There was no, okay, here are the next steps. Here's some information about the disease. Here are some resources. There was absolutely nothing. It was good luck, Mrs. Webster. And as a result of not being properly educated on this disease, not knowing what to have, it really had a significant impact on the quality of care, safety that she was not to receive. And it had a ripple effect on my health and my life. And so imagine sitting in a doctor's office and getting a diagnosis of cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and the doctor says, good luck. Unfortunately, that was in 2006. Unfortunately, this is still occurring, okay? It's still happening. And so as a result of not being properly educated, not knowing how to navigate the disease. I was at the time a sandwich generation caregiver. I was like 38 years old. I had 3 young kids. I had a career and something else. My life turned into just a cyclone of care. I went into this not knowing anything. And inevitably, which I see a lot, I ended up suffering a very, very, very severe nervous burnout in 2011. Not only because of being a caregiver, but other life's traumas and life's realities that had mounted. And as part of my healing journey in 2011, I needed medical attention. I needed a lot of psychological support as well. I decided to lean into this field. I became fascinated by why is it that when family members are receiving a diagnosis of dementia, there's no information that is shared with them. And at this point, I was 5 years into my journey. I had friends of mine or people in the community that were coming up to me and saying, Claire, I know that you've gone through this or you're going through this. We just got a diagnosis, a family member. Could we have a coffee? Can we sit down? Can we meet? And I really found kind of like this strength. It was really good part of my healing that I was able to share my experience with others. And so I really began my journey in 2011 as a very passionate volunteer. I volunteered for a grassroots organization in Montreal called Alzheimer Group. And then one day came a call from a McGill University professor asking me if I would come and speak to the medical students at McGill. And then next came, I was doing so much volunteer work that my husband said, you know what, Claire, you should become like a professional like consultant in education with dementia. And it really began like that. And here we are, in 2025. And since that time, I have a private consulting firm called Caregiver Crosswalk, where I help families navigate the journey. My practice is on Zoom so that I can help families who live all over the world. And then I had this incredible opportunity to develop this amazing program at McGill University.
Wow. And there's so much I want to unpack in terms of your own story and learn more, because I think there might be a lot of people who are going to watch or listen to this episode who are maybe experiencing the same thing. And so I can imagine what their questions might be. So we're going to get to all that, don't worry. But I think just to provide context, from the perspective of just the science and the learning, could you tell me what dementia and Alzheimer's is? What is the science around that? And also, what is the implication of that? Like, what are the numbers, just to understand the scope of what's going on, either in Canada or the world?
So first of all, everybody asks the question, what's the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's? Dementia is an umbrella term. It would be like if you said to me, I have cancer, and then I would say, well, what type of cancer do you have? So under the umbrella of dementia, there are different types of illnesses that cause dementia. Alzheimer's disease, frontal temporal dementia, vascular dementia, Lewy body, and then the early onset that impacts people under the age of 60. Okay, so that's it. In terms of scope, I mean, you've got on a global scale over 55 million people that are diagnosed with the disease. The challenge is that for the biggest challenge, number one, is that most people don't understand the early signs and symptoms. So first of all, dementia is unfortunately a terminal illness. If a person doesn't have any pre-existing health conditions, so a person could have dementia, but at the same time have cancer, have heart issues, so they may pass away from one of those comorbidities. But if they don't have that, it is a terminal illness, because as the disease evolves, first it's very cognitive, right? So it's impacting a person's ability to understand, to absorb words, their vocabulary. So it's very, very cognitive. But as the disease goes through its evolution, then it really has an impact on a person's what we call activities of daily living. So their ability to get dressed, to prepare meals, to function on a day-to-day basis, right? And then as the disease, so we call it, there's an early stage, there's a middle stage, and there's a late stage. And as we're moving from the middle stage to the late stage, a person will become incontinent, they'll have trouble with their bowel movements, they're requiring more and more care. Unfortunately, most people will require, 24-hour, 7-day-a-week care. So this is where transition has to take place. And, it impacts their mobility, it impacts their vision, and they really need round-the-clock care. And on average, the disease from the beginning of the diagnosis until the end is, ballpark could be about 10 years. My mother, from the moment she was diagnosed to the moment she passed away, was 10 years. What's hard is that many times the seeds of the disease could begin planted a couple years before a person receives a diagnosis. So it could begin with significant errors in their finances. It could begin with conspiracy theories. So they're believing somebody's cheating on them or stealing from them, or they're having all of these unbelievable beliefs. The majority of people who receive a diagnosis are in their 80s, okay? Dementia is not a normal part of aging, however. Okay, it is not a normal part of aging, but as a population, we're living longer. So that's why we're seeing more cases, because in the 1950s or 1960s, if you had high blood pressure, high cholesterol, there was no medication to manage that, right? So people are now managing these other coexisting health conditions a lot better. So people are living longer, okay? So and is it increasing? It is increasing. And the challenge again is there are really not many public awareness campaigns about dementia. We see public awareness campaigns about depression, heart and stroke, but we keep talking about, well, we want to catch it early. Well, how can you catch it early, and live your best life possible if you're not creating enough awareness about what this disease is?
I'm imagining your mom in that appointment where she's already resentful that you're dragging her to this appointment, and then she's had a massive symbolic piece of freedom taken from her where she's no longer able to drive, which means she's now reliant on other people. All of them are like signals, you're getting old, you're getting old, and then you also have this thing that is misunderstood. So I wonder if you could speak to the degree to which you're sharing about your own lived experience, but maybe also through what your work, you're hearing other people talk about, that there's the disease itself, and then there's the personal experience of the person being diagnosed who may have an understanding in their cognitive moments that something is happening that is serious and that will put them on the fast track to decline, and how that has an impact on relationships within the family and the sort of pulls and pressures that surface as a result of that.
So it's awful. And and when I was saying earlier that it affects people in their 80s, the majority of the people that I'm working with are really in their 70s. So my mother was diagnosed at the age of 74. In retrospect, it probably began when she was 68. She had some minor, like, mini strokes. My mother was a very independent woman. My mother was from Finland. She was what we call like a stubborn Finn. And she would tell me earlier on, I would say probably, so she was diagnosed in 2006, probably about 2002, 2003, she would start telling me that she felt different. And like her early signs were like she would start to forget words, just the proper name for like glasses or things like that. Taking away a person's driving ability, taking a person's ability to manage their own finances is absolutely devastating. Okay. It's so hard on the person and it's so hard on the family. And when I work with families, I always say you need to make sure that you work with, whether that be a family doctor, geriatrician, neurologist, because it really should be the doctor who says to the person, it's, unfortunately, you're no longer able to drive, or I recommend that you hand the finances and have some help with that. But not everybody is self-aware. That's what the other challenge with the disease. So it's a very cruel disease. Like there are some people where there's different personalities. So we say the ones that are kind of like happy in the moment, where they're actually aware of what's going on. They accept this diagnosis, and there are the people that you see very much like to participate in the day center activities, and they understand what's going on. Then you have the people that they notice some changes at the beginning. They start to panic because they say to themselves, "Oh my gosh, I took care of my mother or my father and I feel this happening." So they're living in the earlier stages with a sense of absolute panic and anxiety. But then as the disease takes its course, they're no longer aware, and so they start fighting it. Okay. And then you have those people that are the fighters from the beginning. They are really not aware. And there's this term that not too many people are familiar with, but it's called anosognosia, where it means that the person that is displaying the symptoms has a complete loss of insight. Okay, and it's an actual disease that is caused by dementia, and I would say more than half the people who have dementia have anosognosia. So that means as a family member, you're noticing all these changes. You're noticing that your spouse is they're not cooking the way they used to. They're not dressing themselves the way they used to. They're accusing you of cheating or stealing, or they're making these unbelievable financial decisions. And the family's saying, like, what is going on? And you're trying to argue and reason. And as much as you argue and reason, the person is saying, there's nothing wrong with me. What's wrong with you? And that is the most challenging for families, because they're realizing all these changes are happening. And now you got to get this person to the doctor. And the person's like, I don't need to go to the doctor. There's nothing wrong with me. And that was with my mother. Like, she felt at the beginning that something was wrong. But by the time she needed to see a doctor, she was in total denial that anything was wrong. Right. And so they fight it and they fight it, and they're so angry. And most people, like in my mother's case, they'll never go back to another doctor's appointment because now they hate this doctor for making this diagnosis. There's also the term Alzheimer's, which still brings a tremendous amount of stigma. People don't want to hear it. Like, she forbid me to ever say the word. So that's difficult for families. And these are all the things that we're not prepared for, right? And one of the big recommendations that I have is, if you have a doctor's appointment set up, it's your first appointment set up to see a specialist, please send in the signs and symptoms, all the signs and symptoms that you're witnessing to the doctor or the nurse clinician ahead of time. Don't speak about the person in front of them. Tell them that you're going for an annual physical checkup, and as part of a checkup, they do, it's all about healthy brain, healthy heart, right? But it's horrible. And so a lot of people are nervous, like, how do I take away the car? How do I take away the finances? I always say, and unfortunately, you have to get to a point where it involves tough love. This is a disease, and as a family member, caregiver, your number one responsibility is to ensure that your loved one is safe, that they're happy in whatever that word means, and for me, being clean, because clean means that you're taking care of the dignity of the person, right? But at some point, you have to, it's like almost like plunging into a cold pool and saying, I don't want to do it, I don't want to do it. But you love this person so much. And the role of the family member becomes that of an advocate, right? Because they don't have the ability to make the right decisions on behalf of themselves.
I'm just imagining what it would be like to sit in an office and what it would feel like to the parent hearing all of the observations from the child. So just that important piece of advice is to send all of the clues, all of the observations ahead of time, so you're not raking them over the coal. They're not feeling like their ego is under attack. They're not feeling like they're being personally maligned, right? That's a really important takeaway, which I guess would lend itself to, I know you've written a book about this. Could you hold it up for the camera for those who are watching?
Yes, this is my team and I, McGill. It was really spearheaded by my colleagues, Dr. Serge Gauthier, Dr. José Moret, who's a geriatrician. And this was like a really multidisciplinary effort. And we've created this book at McGill. It's available on our website, mcgill.ca/dementia. And it's available in 14 languages. People could download it for free because dementia doesn't discriminate, right? And so our objective is to make sure that this book, reaches as many people as possible. In Montreal, it's distributed throughout most of the memory clinics, and many of the CLSC social workers have it as well. But it's really important. What the book doesn't say, however, and this is where we're
For 2 seconds, Claire, before you go on, I want to read the title for those who are listening to it on audio: Dementia, Your Companion Guide. Repeat the website where it can be downloaded.
So it can be downloaded for free at www.mcgill.ca/dementia, and printed copies are available on Amazon as well for $20, and it goes to support our program. And
that's incredible. What an incredible resource. We're going to have the link in our show notes. Okay, now back over to you. Tell us about the book and things you want to share.
Well, this book was really my prescription of care, because I felt like, I guess, going back to when leaving the doctor's office without any information, education. So for me, this book was just a gift, and it was thanks to the Grace Dart Foundation that we were able to create such a book. But I was hoping that every patient and family would get a book like this, when they leave the office. And in many of the hospitals, when you're waiting to have hip replacement surgery or other surgeries, they give you a book and telling you what to expect, right? So I was really hoping that it could be like that for dementia as well. But what I wanted to say, to go back to disclosing the diagnosis, and I work with many neurologists and geriatricians. There has to be a lot of training with regards to the medical students, because the doctors have to be sure, like, they have to kind of get to know the patient a little bit in the sense of disclosing the diagnosis, and they don't want to have a catastrophic reaction, because what could happen, and does happen, is that if the doctor were to say, Mrs. So-and-so, you have dementia, some people will react and say, I want to kill myself. My life is over. So it has to be done in a very delicate manner. Also, just to be clear that, not all diagnoses can be done after one visit. There's multiple tests that need to be done. Sometimes it's very clear. The person, by the time they get to the doctor, they're already reached the middle phase. And, the doctor is very dependent on the signs and symptoms that are presented to him or her by the family. It's so important for families to really describe all the behaviors or personality changes or memory changes. There are blood tests now that they can have a better detection if it's Alzheimer's. There are CT scans or MRIs that can detect. But sometimes a family might have to go 2 or 3 times if the person is not refusing to go back to that doctor, right? So it's not just about saying, okay, you have Alzheimer's. It's about, okay, how are we going to disclose this? Maybe we need to say to the patient, well, you've got some memory issues, or we're investigating. So there's a whole, you have to be very delicate around it. And one of my colleagues is actually working on a handbook for medical students all about disclosing the diagnosis.
So what you're describing, very delicate, could almost be reframed as how can doctors be empathic in that communication, right? Yeah, that's what I'm hearing. So that's one relationship, the doctor to the patient who's disclosing. I wonder also how would, from all the work you've done and the research and your own lived experience, how can we be empathic to the parent, assuming it's a parent, from the point of view of the relationship and the caregivers that are family members?
So one of the biggest challenges that families have when they get this diagnosis is the healthy family members have a really hard time of letting go of who the person was and adapting and evolving to who the person is becoming. Okay, so an example would be, oh well, we still have to have our Sunday night dinners with 20 people come over. Oh, we have to bring them up north every weekend. We have to bring them to Florida. We have to take them to the mall. But they're doing all this because it's the family that feels, well, we can't let go because that's what we used to do. But what I work on with families constantly is saying, you really have to start taking a look at this person's now, what are their limitations? Maybe those dinners don't work anymore. It's overstimulating for them. Maybe just have a lunch. Maybe don't invite 20 people. Maybe just have 4 people. Is there too many, like there's a TV on and the dogs are running around, the grandkids running around. Maybe putting them in a car or getting on a plane and changing their routine is too much. And this is where families have such a hard time, especially spouses, because when you have a spouse who has this illness, the communication starts to go, the intimacy starts to go, that whole relationship starts to go, and it causes a lot of, like, the biggest emotion that families talk to me about, which I had too, was anger, right? You're so angry at this disease because you just can't adapt, right? And so I always say, like, why can't try to embrace what they still can do. So if they can still, play tennis at the beginning, or they can still play bridge, just let them be and don't correct them, right? Don't be constantly telling them, oh no, that's not the way to do it. Not the way, like just embrace what they still can do. And like, because it's constantly evolving, and what they're doing today is not what they're going to be doing in 6 months, and is not going to be doing one in 6 months. So the family has to constantly be in a place where they have to evolve to the illness. And it's not up to the patient to change. It's up to the family members to change. And I think that's one of the hardest things to really learn and do.
Well, you just raised the interesting point that it hadn't even occurred to me, that sometimes it's spouses that are living with someone who has dementia.
Oh, many times, yes.
Many times, right? So what do we need to know as a general public, and maybe as, family members, cousins, nephews, nieces, children, to provide empathy for the spouse that's living with someone who has dementia?
Well, dementia definitely changes the whole family dynamic, right? And what people describe is, whether you're a spouse caring for a spouse or a daughter or son caring for a parent, it there's a lot of boundaries, unfortunately, that change. For example, like it becomes almost like, so if it's my spouse, I feel sometimes I'm taking care of a child, right? Because it's not only the lack of communication, but as the disease is progressing, I all of a sudden have to help my husband eat his dinner. He's incontinent, so I've got to change him. I've got to help him go to the washroom. I've got to help him bath. There could be accidents. And so I think what people have to realize, that it's because there's a lot of physical parts of it, and that's what people are always surprised to hear, how it impacts a person physically, that caregivers or family members are really not recognizing their boundaries. And in a family, it causes conflict because, first of all, unless everybody's educated on this disease and understands the disease equally, they'll say, oh, mom's still fine, she's still fine, right? Because the parent doesn't want to really share with the kids of what's truly going on, right? And then there's always this resentment where sometimes there's one sibling perhaps living in Montreal that's doing everything, but the other siblings are out of town, and they're not sharing the responsibilities, right? So when I work with families, I say, look, we have to share the responsibilities to avoid conflict. Even if you live out of town, maybe you can help with the finances, maybe you can help with some medical appointments. But what's hard is when it comes to spouses, there's this guilt where they feel, I shouldn't ask for help. I don't want to burden my kids. They have their own lives. I really can't ask for help. I'm going to do everything myself. But we really have to reassure, if it's the mother that's the caregiver, the father's the giver, we really have to reassure them that they need help. Because if you don't get help in taking care of this person, you will burn out. I mean, that's 100%. It is absolutely impossible to care for a person living with dementia on your own with some type of support. It's impossible.
Okay, so this circles back to your story. If we could go back to revisit this. So you're a single child, your dad has already passed, your mom is angry that she's taking you to the office, then she has a bunch of freedoms taken away. Of course, she's angry at the diagnosis, she's angry at the doctor, but she's also angry at you, no doubt. And then you have 10 years being a sandwich generation person, taking care of her and your kids. Take us through maybe some of the stories along those 10 years that impacted you.
Oof, so many. So first of all, I have to say that I knew nothing. I didn't even know anything about how to navigate the healthcare system, which is a big challenge, right? So we're given the diagnosis. It was clear she wasn't able to live alone anymore. She was living about half an hour away from me, so I was going back and forth, back and forth. I did not know the difference between private residences or the public system, like the way in Montreal it's called the role of the CLSCs, the social workers, the navigation. I did not know. All I knew is that there was this private residence close by to where we were living. And again, against her will. Fortunately, my father had been a forward thinker, so I had the power of attorney, so I had the ability to make some decisions. So I moved her into a private residence, and at the time it wasn't, because she was in the earlier stages still, so she was able to still be what they call in the independent living part with some support. I get her moved in, and for a while actually she blossomed. I didn't realize how isolated my mother was, being in an environment where her meals were prepared for her. She had some social stimulation. It was really good. But then everything goes wrong. From 2008 to 2010, everything goes wrong. The first thing that started happening was, well, I was still, running around like a chicken with my head cut off all the time, trying to be the best mom, the best wife, the best member of society, the best friend. Nobody in my entire journey, nobody from the healthcare system ever asked me how I was doing, ever. Never asked me how I was doing. And I was had that superwoman syndrome where I thought I could do it all. So in 2008, and that summer, my son, who was 11 years old at the time, I decided that he was going to go to a summer camp for 2 weeks. And I was like, one kid out of the house, it would be a bit of a break. Well, wouldn't you know it, the first day that he's at the summer camp, we get this emergency call that he and this other boy tried to open up a picnic table, and the picnic table fell on top of him, crushing his leg. He had to be taken to the hospital with a broken femur. He was 3 weeks in traction. Then he had a wheelchair. Then he had to be rehabilitated. So this happens in June. And then he in November of that year, he had to go back to the hospital because he had these 2 titanium rods taken out. A week after that, I get a call from my mother's residence saying that she can no longer walk. So my mother needed to have emergency hip replacement surgery. Nobody had warned me the impact of the anesthesia would have on a person with Alzheimer's. Nobody had prepared me on how you have to advocate for a patient with Alzheimer's alone in the hospital. So we go to the hospital, and I remember that time of the year was really busy. My kids had different activities with school and all this. So I take a Sharpie and I put my cell number on top of the bed in the hospital saying, if there's an emergency, please call me. So she has her surgery. The next day, I say to my son, we were on a way to do a concert practice. I said, let's go see your grandmother, just like that. So we arrive at the hospital, and it's code blue. She's having a heart attack. Nobody had called me, right? So she had suffered a heart attack post-surgery, taken to intensive care, thrashing, trying to pull out all the IVs from her arms because she's not understanding what's going on. They stabilize her. Then they bring her up to the room where she apparently, we think, falls out of the bed and has a broken femur, goes back to surgery. And normally with a hip replacement surgery, you have to be walking that same day. So this ordeal that happened in November, she ended up getting transferred to a rehabilitation center and where she spent almost 6 months and was never able to be rehabilitated because she couldn't understand the instructions from the OT. So it was one thing after another, after another, after another. And I was convinced that I could do everything myself, right? I had the 3 kids, they were young. I had an ex-husband. My son was from my first marriage. So I was dealing with that dynamic as well. My husband was dealing with some issues with his business and with his family as well. And, the odd friend that would ask me, Claire, can I help? Can I pick up the kids from school? I was like, no, I'm all good. I'm all good. I can do it. But what happens, which is typical, we all have coping mechanisms in life. We all do. And my coping mechanism was alcohol. So I'd get home, I'd pick up the kids from school at 4:30, get home, crack open up a bottle of wine. By 6 o'clock, the bottle's finished. Second bottle of wine, right? And I was so angry. And the one bottle becomes two. I don't even remember putting my kids to bed. I live with heart issues that I've had my whole life, which definitely has an impact also on the heart. And it was a mess. And, as I was watching my mother unravel, my kids were watching their mother unravel, right? And I was putting so much pressure on myself to do it all and to be it all. And what really amazed me was along this whole way, there's nobody helping you navigate anything, right? I'm at the hospital. There's nobody asking me if I'm okay. There's nobody helping me navigate. There's nobody at the rehabilitation center telling me what's next. Can I get support? Nothing, nothing. And I think that's what really sparked my, like, how do we change this? And, I had no affiliation with McGill University at all. I didn't go to McGill. My kids didn't go. I didn't know, but I said, we have to change the healthcare system on how caregivers are treated. And I said, I live in a city with one of the best medical schools in the world. We need to do something here. And I was fortunate enough to meet the former dean, David Eidelman, who believed in what I wanted to accomplish. But my story of the burnout and that feeling overwhelmed is typical. It's like when I meet with family caregivers, like my story is their story, and I, as I mentioned, I used alcohol. Some people use alcohol and Ativan or weed or cigarettes or food or shopping. Everybody has something, right? And I think that when I was able to say, look, I have a problem here, that's when the healing has to begin. And the other truth is that, I kept saying to myself, okay, when my caregiving years are over, the alcoholism will stop. It doesn't, because these addictions, these dependencies can turn into addictions. So I had to stop drinking like for 2 years just to completely like reset myself. But this is typical, unfortunately. These are the stories that I work with, and it doesn't only have to apply to dementia. When you are dealing with a disease that interrupts your life, okay, like really interrupts your life, and you don't understand, you don't ask questions, you're not well informed, you feel lost, this can happen because the go-to emotion, like I mentioned earlier, like when I was angry. I was angry all the time. And you get angry because you don't feel like you're in control of what is taking place.
I'm taking all of this in because I want to start by saying thank you for sharing, because I'm sure that people who are listening are feeling a sense of kinship with you. And I want to just uplift that for a second, because it's one thing to read the bio, it's one thing to know you navigated that, and then it's a whole other thing to hear you share what you just shared. And so you've just given permission to other people to share what there is to share. And so two things sort of from an empathy point of view that come up right away is You mentioned how important it would be for the healthcare providers within the system to actually acknowledge you in the mix. So how are you doing to take that question seriously and for there to be support around that, acknowledged within the healthcare system as a whole? So that I heard loud and clear. And then I also heard, and this is like a tricky balance, like friends saying like, hey, I'll pick up your kids, or I'll do you a lot, I'm happy to shop for you, or I'll make you some food, like we would for a new mom, for example. And you're like super momming it, right? You're like, no, I'm okay. I'm sensing this need for community around a family that is going through, whether it's dementia, Alzheimer's, or any other chronic disease like you're talking about. It doesn't have to be those diseases or illnesses. So if there's the periphery community listening to this as well, how can we properly support caregivers in this?
So I've had the privilege over the last few years. So I do a lot of education of the medical students at McGill. I give a lot of talks to healthcare professionals. And one of the first things I start off with is saying, if you get a woman like me in your office and I'm stressed out or I'm tired of crying, like, don't take it personally. Because I said, by the time we've arrived at your office or I've gotten that call that my mother has a place in the public care and I'm stressed out of my mind and I'm rude, please know there's a story behind this woman. And I said, you have to understand the impact that it has. So I really spend a lot of time making them realize like the stories, like who am I, what I've gotten, I'm not just caring for my mother, but I'm caring for my three kids, and I'm caring for all of that. We have a healthcare system right now that it's being very challenged. Like today for example, if in Montreal, if I needed to have an assessment, because the first step in getting some home care support or the transition to a long-term care is I have to make that call to a CLSC social worker. And they themselves are burning out. They themselves don't necessarily have the lack of training. And it's going to take about 6 months for a social worker to come in and see me. Then they do the evaluation, and then what care you have. So, I think that what's needed is that there's got to be probably a greater training for the healthcare professionals about empathy, about, compassion. And I always try to put that mix when I am speaking to the students of the future. But also, I think that, when I work with families, it's really up to us to advocate for ourselves, right? Like we have to advocate for ourselves. When people say, oh, I've made this call and that call, I said, well, don't sit by the phone and wait for the call. You've got to advocate for yourselves. If I go back to, what would I have done differently is I would have said yes more often. I would have said yes to help. I would have taken more time to look for, I'm there's a lot of great organizations that provide group support. I was never a group support person. I needed more. I preferred to have more one-on-ones. I did have to get some psychological support. So I work with an excellent psychologist. But I wish I would have done it earlier. Wish I would have done it more often. I'm fortunate to have a very, very patient husband, because many times when you're going through this type of unbelievable burnout stress, it has impacts on marriages, it impacts on families. I have three kids, and my youngest daughter, who's now 20, but she was 9 when we were really going through this, and it had a significant impact on her. Like she ended up suffering from a lot of anxiety. I think as women, we underestimate the impact of stress. As I mentioned earlier, I have lived with a heart condition my whole life. So I've been a patient of the healthcare system and know how challenging that is, and how to advocate for yourself. But there were nights where an ambulance would come to our home at 3 o'clock in the morning because I was in massive tachycardia. And there's my 9-year-old looking out the window, seeing mommy taken away, right? And there's a lot of things I would have done differently, and I think I would have educated myself better. I would have educated myself better on the disease. I would have educated myself better on what support there was. And even if the healthcare system doesn't ask me for help, if I need help, I would have said to them, what can you do to help me? which is now what I do with the people that I work with.
So one of the things that comes up, because you were talking about the jurisdiction of healthcare within Montreal, Quebec, Canada, socialized Medicare, and different access to some private opportunities, whether it's a psychologist or otherwise. Thinking listeners and viewers from other parts of the world, U.S. included, where medical attention definitely has an implication on pocketbook, and it's not the same for everybody depending on what resources you have. So I wonder if there are some resources, websites, books, practices of self-care, self-empathy that are available to people who might not have the resources necessarily to help a parent or a spouse transition where there is no other reality for them. What comes up for you?
So, well, caregiving to a person living with dementia is very specific. So if you're in Canada, I mean, well, first of all, I will always promote the McGill University Dementia Education Program because we work very hard on developing the free resources. There's also the Alzheimer's Society of Canada that has excellent, excellent resources for caregivers. In the United States, it's Alzheimer's Association, Inc. If you're watching from Europe, I mean, Europe is doing a great job. There's Alzheimer's UK, Alzheimer's Scotland. So in these particular Alzheimer's associations, they always have really, really good sections just pertaining to caregivers. A great resource is Alzheimer's Disease International, so alz.org. So they are the global governing federation. The McGill, my colleagues and I had the great opportunity of writing 2 world reports. In 2021, it was called A Journey Through the Diagnosis of Dementia, and the 2022 World Report, which is all about navigating post-diagnostic management and care. And we really highlight what it's like around the world to be a caregiver. We have testimonials from people living with the disease, from caregivers. But these sites, Alzheimer's of your country, really have amazing information resources, particularly for the caregiver.
Well, we're going to include those reports, links to those reports in the show notes as well. Claire, I want to just take a moment to just honor the journey that you have been on as a human being, and obviously the mission you are on with your own work and the ongoing advocacy you do on behalf of the people affected by it is just thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And I congratulations on how much you personally have, transformed through this odyssey. It's just remarkable. I always end the interview with my guests with the same question, and that is if you can think of a moment in your life. It could be recent, it could be a long time ago, it could be a small thing, it could be a big thing, doesn't matter. But if you could share what that was when you were on the receiving end of empathy and what that meant for you.
So I think that this example was definitely a defining moment that helped propel this work that I'm doing. So I had a very, very difficult relationship with my father. My father was much older than my mother. He was not healthy. My father came from Egypt, and as I mentioned earlier, my mother came from Finland. And I grew up in a home really watching my mother care for him, and he had physical issues, and not cognitive, but physical issues. He suffered from depression. It was very, very difficult. And throughout most of my life, I resented him a lot. I really resented him. I resented him for never being well. I resented him for the pressure that he put on my mother, and probably a lot of the pressure that he placed on me. And so and it was difficult. And I had really kind of like distanced myself from him throughout the years. I mean, as he was aging and when he was getting in his 80s, he was finally given a prescription for antidepressants many years too late, but he was getting calmer and all this. I'd been pregnant with my 3rd child. Had been on bed rest, had a very difficult pregnancy. And after I gave birth to Sienna, I went to my parents' apartment to visit him. And when I showed up there, my father was sitting in their den, like Jabba the Hutt. He had been so blown up, clearly not, like really not well. And, my mother had been the one caring for him. He was becoming afraid of hospitals. He'd gone to the hospital so much and he didn't want to go to hospitals, but I knew something was wrong. So I said, we have to call like a nurse. We have to call 911. So my father was brought to the hospital, and that's when I actually saw my mother was unraveling, because like she was just we arrived at the hospital. She started yelling at all the nurses. We got to the ER. My mother and I were accused of neglect, which was absolutely crazy because my mother had been caring for this man the whole time. And for the next 2 months prior to his death, because it was clear that my mother was not, like, it was in the early stages before she was even diagnosed, I said, okay, you can't come anymore. So I made the decision to go. And I started realizing that if you're an older person in a hospital, you really can't be alone. But all my years growing up with him, for me, he was you're this burden, like you're a burden. You're just, it was never healthy. But I think it was this incredible shock that there he was in the hospital. He was so incredibly vulnerable. And I started really paying attention of, okay, he's in the ER, like they bring him his food and nobody was coming over and like helping him eat. He couldn't sit up. Then they were saying he wasn't eating, so they would bring a can of Ensure, but nobody was opening up the can of Ensure. And I had to, because my mother clearly wasn't able to have any relationship with the nurses. So then he was getting transferred to the other floor, and it was clear that he wasn't going to make it, that he was he was having congestive heart failure. And I hate to say it, but almost like with my mother, it was almost like the gift of my father's illness. Because the gift of my father's illness was that for the first time in my life, I was able to go, I was able to spend time with him. We were able to have these conversations that we had never had in my entire life. He apologized to me for how hard he was on me, and I remember just spending nights there. And the hard part was that I have no recollection of my youngest daughter's first couple of months of life because I was just so focused on him. But it's when I really learned empathy. Because it was not only about him, but I was paying attention to like how older people were being treated when there wasn't a representative for, if the family members weren't coming. And I couldn't believe it. And then I kept saying to myself, well, one day this is going to be me, right? This is going to be me. And I think I finally understood his pain and he wasn't, his lack of mobility, and how unbelievably vulnerable this man was. And I was alone with him when he passed away. My husband was sick and couldn't come to the hospital. My mother was in no capacity to come to the hospital. And it was really a defining moment for me. And I think it was one of the first things that propelled me to say, I'm going to do work and I'm going to become an advocate for seniors, because this cannot happen.
Incredibly moved by that story. I'm incredibly moved by that story. And I know that listeners and viewers are incredibly moved by that story. You have been so generous with the entire podcast. I just say thank you, Claire. Really, thank you so much.
Well, I really appreciate sharing, because I feel like, if I could help somebody, I spent so many years swallowing my tears and swallowing my emotions. So I hope that if my story can have an impact on somebody, I've done my work. Thank you for having me. Really, thank you for inviting me.
So thank everybody who's been watching and listening. Feel free to add to the show notes any comments you want to share with Claire. We'll see you next week at Purposeful Empathy.
If you know someone who would benefit from this episode, please share it with them now. Post the link to your socials, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button. The world needs more empathy, and you have an important role to play.